Welcome to the Christian Life Coach Collective. I'm your host, Laura Malone, and you are in the right place if you want to make an impact in your life and the lives of the people around you. Maybe you even want to turn your gift of helping others into an income so you can support your family and your dreams and make a way for your calling. I'm here to guide you because you deserve to have encouragement and resources and somebody invested in you as you go invest yourself into everyone else. Let's dive into today's episode. Hey friends, there's so much going on in the world right now, and man, it is so much. And I said in the last episode, 275, we're going to do a little series called Finding Hope in the Storm. And it's because, I run a disaster relief organization. We're deployed in Asheville, North Carolina right now after major flooding and devastation of entire towns. And then last night, overnight, Hurricane Milton hit the Gulf side of Florida and devastated across the state to the Atlantic side. There's so much going on, not just in regards to weather in America. There's so much happening in the world. And I also know there's so much happening in your world, in your sphere of influence, your household, your heart. I know that there's a lot going on. And today, I want to talk about compassion fatigue because I can't tell you how many people do not even know that that is a thing. And it breaks my heart because it's just this little tidbit of information that if you knew what it was, if you could define it and identify it, it would be so helpful to normalize how you're feeling because there's so much that comes with compassion fatigue. It's not just the type of compassion that you think, oh, I'm just, the kind of compassion that is like, oh, little kids crying and I want to just hug them and I want to wrap them in my arms and, sing a sweet lullaby to them. It's not that, or at least it's not only that. The places where you feel like you're giving compassion and the places, the times and scenarios you can envision that makes you think, oh, that's what compassion is. Compassion is caring for people. And sometimes compassion and caring for people doesn't look like giving them a hug. It looks like giving them a meal. It looks like getting in the kitchen as opposed to sitting on the couch next to them so that you can create a new nutritious meal and you can actually serve them what they need for their body to physically keep going. Compassion and caring for people often looks like knowing what that person needs, knowing what is necessary, what's the next step that they need to take, and doing what you can to help them take that. Motherhood is one long 2, 3, 4 decade-long strand of caring and being compassionate for people. And oftentimes moms have a really high level of compassion fatigue, and it leads them to believe certain things about who they are because they don't understand why they feel so burnt out or so powerless to break the emotional cycles they're in simply because they are just fatigued by being a caregiver. And you can be a caregiver without having, being a nurse and being somebody who is doing the physical care for somebody. The emotional, mental input that you put into other people, that is what creates the fatigue. So compassion fatigue is the physical, emotional, and psychological impact of helping people. So it's a natural consequence of being somebody who cares deeply, right? And it doesn't have to lead to burnout, but often it does. And let's just consider burnout is working too much for too long. And maybe that work is mental, emotional, or physical, or a blend. But burnout is what happens when there's too much of it for too long. And sometimes there's also a loss of passion for helping people when you hit that fatigue. And especially if you hit burnout, You might start thinking like, I just don't care about this anymore. But it's really just what's happening because you can't care because you're empty, right? So by learning how to recognize the signs and also practicing self-care and seeking out some support, you can prevent compassion fatigue, but you can also recover from it. So if you're in the position of supporting other people who are experiencing compassion fatigue, then you're going to need some empathy, you're going to need to know how to give practical help and also encourage them as they're in that healing process. And maintaining emotional health and well-being is essential not only for the caregivers themselves, but for the people they're caring for. Because when the caregiver, the mom, the nurse, the first responder, the teacher, whoever you are, that you're feeling fatigued. But when you heal, when you're thriving, then everything you do to care for people and the compassion you operate from, it's more sustainable, right? So you can actually have greater impact because you're taking care of yourself. I want to do a little identifying of empathy, sympathy, and compassion. So empathy is identifying with the emotions and the experiences of others. Sympathy is feeling your own emotions about what those people are experiencing, okay? So sympathy is, I am so sad that those people lost their house in the tornado. Now, those people aren't feeling sad right now. They're feeling angry at the injustice, and they're feeling shocked. You are feeling sad. That is your own emotion about what those people are experiencing. Empathy is the ability to identify with the anger and shock those people are experiencing because you likely have lost something to the same unexpected, unjust way, right? So now you have an empathy and you're identifying with the exact emotion that they're experiencing. Compassion is caring about the situation and wanting to help people who are affected by it. So empathy and compassion fatigue are both considered what we would call a secondary traumatic stress. Secondary trauma is what happens when you see or hear somebody else's or hear about somebody else's crisis. And listening to their stories can really take its toll on you because stress is cumulative. So you have your own life and you have your own stress and you have your own things you're dealing with. And then when you are put in a position where you're caring for somebody else, if you're a first responder, if you're in the medical field, if you're a chaplain, if you are somebody who goes out into situations where you're willing to be an active listener and you're willing to help people in the situation they're in, or maybe you're a caregiver, a long-term caregiver who goes in to help people in their home, like kind of a hospice or home care situation, all of those things accumulate. So because stress is cumulative, any continued exposure to your trauma or somebody else's trauma produces a likelihood that you're going to have some level of secondary trauma, the secondary traumatic stress that now you have to deal with. You're going to need to process that, right? And events for anybody are always more traumatic when they're not expected, when you weren't prepared for it, when you feel powerless to prevent it or get through it, especially if it occurs repeatedly or if there's any intentional cruelty or abuse, if there's occurrences in childhood that begin that or are triggered by a current event. And especially if you're afraid, like if you're afraid for your life. So with this hurricane, people knew a hurricane was coming in Florida, right? Let's talk about Hurricane Helene. Florida knew it was coming. Florida is very used to hurricanes. North Carolina and the mountains of Asheville are not, right? So Florida expected a hurricane and the mountains of North Carolina didn't. Florida was prepared to some degree, but then it gets down to the household and the individual. Are they preparing for the hurricane? Because so many hurricanes come and go and don't do anything. And so it shifts in the brain. Oh my gosh, again, and I've lived places where hurricanes hit multiple times. So I've evacuated myself and I've stayed through lower level storms. And you do just kind of get like, oh my gosh, I can't evacuate every single time. But you don't know when is the time that was a wrong choice until it's hindsight. And then you're really powerless to prevent the damage that a hurricane is going to do. You can, of course, mitigate things in your own home and you can put the lawn chairs away. You can do things. But you can't change the circumstances of the hurricane. And hurricanes occur, especially this year, repeatedly. And so that's even more traumatic. And a lot of people, and we got phone calls from people yesterday, afraid for their lives. They ran out of gas. They could not leave. They were in a position where the storm surge was going to be really high and they couldn't get their families out. That leads to so much more trauma. And last week we talked about this. There's a version of, I've got to focus now. I will have to feel this later, right? So a lot of people are just intent on, we've got to survive the storm. Whether that storm's a hurricane or a divorce or bankruptcy, it doesn't matter if it's inner or outer. There's a lot of times where we just feel like I just have to survive the storm. And some of the things that we believe about storms that I would call a myth are things like, this is my job, this is my responsibility, I can handle it. Or I've seen worse, I've been through worse, we've lived through worse. So minimizing this storm by comparing it to things that you think were worse is a myth because it's relative to now. These are storms are not things we can compare. A storm is a storm is a storm, right? Another myth is I have to be strong for everybody else. I understand that in the focus now, feel later thing, but at the same time, sometimes you're trying to be strong and you're trying to hold things together that are already cracked, and it can actually do a disservice and it actually can be harmful. You have to be really careful with that belief. Another one is, if I don't meet the need, nobody else will. And one of the problems with that, especially in crisis and running this disaster relief organization for almost 2 decades, is that it's really easy to say, I don't need to sleep, I don't need to eat, there's more work to do, and there's not enough people to help, and I've got to get out there. So then people don't take care of themselves, and they don't get the care and compassion they need for themselves because they minimize, especially if they say, well, what is a lack of sleep to me? Those people lost their homes, or that person lost a loved one. So what do I care if I sleep? Sleep is nothing. But the problem is that you're not taking care of yourself. And then now tomorrow you faint, you pass out because you haven't eaten, you haven't sleeping, you haven't slept. Or you start getting really cranky and you're not being helpful to anybody because you haven't eaten and you haven't slept. So there's so many things that if you don't have boundaries and you're not taking care of yourself, then you can slip into these myths and operate from them. And they are not always helpful. Sometimes they're unhelpful. Sometimes they're harmful, right? So let's talk about the signs of compassion fatigue, because it's really important for you as a survivor of a storm, inner or outer, and when you're going through it and when you're past it. It's essential that you are able to recognize symptoms and signs of compassion fatigue, but it's also important for you to recognize it in other people. I have to keep an eye out and make sure that my leaders and my responders and volunteers are not getting into a place where they're so fatigued that it would be harmful to them or to others. So let's talk about some signs and some symptoms. Some physical things are headaches and body aches, any kind of persistent physical discomfort, and basically, physical fatigue, so extreme tiredness that is not improving, it's not recovering after getting sleep and rest. And then a weakened immune system, things that where the body is not resistant to colds and flus and things like that because there's a weak immune system. That's actually a symptom of compassion fatigue. The reduced concentration, like inability to focus, to remember tasks, brain fog, the loss of purpose, kind of like, why did I take this job? Just starting to disconnect from why am I in this role? How did this happen? How did I get here? And starting to feel a detachment from the purpose that you first felt. I know in motherhood, it's real common for women to feel that way. Like, what? Of course I love being a mom. But starting to forget why I said I wanted to be a mom because I'm exhausted. I am fatigued in every possible way, but I don't know what to do. And I want this. And so there starts to feel like a dissonance between the two. I want to do what I am called to do. I'm a nurse or I'm a firefighter and I love it, but I'm starting to feel disconnected from why I love it. Negative thoughts, worst case scenarios, starting to feel hopeless, starting to feel and believe that the work you do isn't making a difference, that you're not getting anywhere. That's really common for first responders in massive man-made or natural disasters when it just feels like the need is unending, especially something like 9/11, what that created. It began to really stir up a lot of hopelessness and like, this is never going, there's just not enough that we can do to help. We'll never recover from this. In the moment, of course, there's been a recovery from that. There always is a measure of recovery available. But in the storm, it never feels like recovery is possible. You really have to hold on to that. You have to cultivate it for yourself. So chronic exhaustion and feeling emotionally drained after getting a break, that is a symptom of being fatigued. Anytime that you rest your brain, your body, your soul, and after rest, there's still just a deep exhaustion, it's pointing to a fatigue. Depression, anxiety, persistent sadness, feeling dread, worry, excessively stressed, high ups and high lows, downs. Numbing and detachment is another one. So beginning to feel indifferent, disengaged, detached, disconnected emotionally from whether it's your patient or the people you're responding to or your loved ones or your children, whoever it is. The numbing of the emotions points to fatigue. And also irritability and frustration, anger, especially if you feel that towards the people you're caring for, or you start feeling resentful towards your role or your job. And then just even lingering anger. It's just like sometimes when that kind of anger just keeps popping up, or it's like a simmer. Maybe it's not a boiling anger all the time, but there's a simmering anger beneath the surface. Withdrawal. People who begin to avoid being, any kind of social situation, church, parties, school, whatever, starting to isolate from friends, family, and normal activities, or neglecting personal needs like hygiene, or skipping meals, not exercising like you used to, not doing the same hobbies that used to be interesting to you. A loss of interest is also just a symptom of it. And definitely sleep disruption. So if you're having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep because your mind begins to rise up and wake up when your body needs to be sleeping and starts to ruminate on the task, the caregiving, the work, the role, the responsibility, the heaviness, any of those kinds of sleep disruptions definitely point to fatigue. And just when you're living in a situation where there's never ending needs, or if there's no distinction between home and work, or there's unhealthy boundaries or a lack of boundaries at all, when you're generally fatigued over a prolonged period of time and exposure to something, repetitive disturbing thoughts, or feeling, I would say this is kind of attached to like starting to detach from your service to people, but beginning to feel bored or irritated while you're caregiving, while you're serving people. That is another area I know it's different than detachment, but actually just having like a feeling of like, bored. I'm bored. Or, these people are so irritating to me. Or the process that I go through every day or every hour in serving people, I'm just starting to get irritated. Starting to feel dissatisfied while you're serving, or having a lack of emotional, physical, or spiritual energy. Just no energy to give yourself in any of these ways to anybody or even for yourself. And avoidance, denial that leads to like the fight or flight. Well, when we head into the flight and we want to escape, sometimes that can get a little drastic for people who don't understand what they're experiencing is really compassion fatigue, but they feel trapped in it, so they want to escape. And then sometimes people can take that to an extreme that becomes not just unhelpful, but harmful, right? Feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, irritable, negative, blaming yourself, blaming other people, feeling apathetic, not having the pleasure that you used to take when you did something fun. So let's say you're not in the storm, so to speak, anymore. The storm is, it's over on the outside, but on the inside, you're still dealing with it, right? And that compassion fatigue can actually rob the fun and the joy that you used to take in doing things that you used to do. So if you used to love to be a runner and now running, the idea of it is boring, or you don't desire to do it anymore. When you begin to lack pleasure in things that you used to take pleasure in, or you lack desire in doing things you used to want to do, points to compassion fatigue. And also just having reduced feelings of empathy and sensitivity that you used to have, like you used to operate at that, and now you don't have that anymore, definitely fatigue. Some people begin to have just chronically be late, and compassion fatigue and burnout can all kind of start manifesting in your life and creating things and consequences and outcomes of what's happening inside of you. So just being late or being sick, those kinds of things can start happening because of what's going on inside, right? Having less of a sense of personal accomplishment or satisfaction or fulfillment in roles, responsibilities, life in general. Gastrointestinal complaints are really common, like stomach problems, digestion problems are really common, definitely connected to your emotional health. Your gut is your second brain. And if it's out of order, especially because of stress, and that leads into stress produces cortisol, and there can be a lot of weight gain in that. Basically having less ability to feel joy, peace, love, compassion overall, right? All of this is kind of summed up in a lack of joy, because compassion fatigue means that you've cared so much for so long, and not be getting filled up. You're empty and you're not filled up. So your gas is gone. The car's been running on empty for a really long time and you didn't pay attention. There's no oil in there either. It's just, it reduces your ability to do what you were made to do, what you used to love to do and thought you wanted to do. And so you're not finding joy and peace and love and satisfaction in what you're doing. So I'm going to wrap up in this episode here by saying this, and we're going to keep talking about compassion in the next episode. But I just want to wrap up here so I don't take too much of your time in this episode. I want you to start take this list and start identifying where these things might be happening in your life. If you think this is possible, that you may have to some degree, some compassion fatigue, or look back in your life and see where these things were happening and these signs and symptoms were there. And maybe you had compassion fatigue and didn't know it. And you've gotten through it, but you're on the other side. But now you can look back and go, oh, that's what that was, right? So I want you to think on that. And I want you to start thinking about the people around you. If they have these symptoms that I've listed, is it possible they actually just need somebody to care for them? If they're irritable, if they're angry, if they're struggling to do what they need to do, if they don't like their work anymore, if they seem detached, is it possible that they've been through so much for so long and they've been caring about something for so long and they're carrying it on their own and they're not getting filled up and nobody's there to take care of them and they don't have language for it? Now you do. Is it possible that you could help them? You would be able to reach out and offer them compassion, have grace for them. We're going to talk in the next episode about that very thing. And we're going to talk about how to process and heal from compassion fatigue. But then we're going to talk about some questions that you could ask somebody you think is struggling with it and in the middle of it and how to support them. So here's the thing. I'm going to wrap up by saying what I heard somebody say once. We're called to care, but God is called to cure. We just simply can't live under the burden of the belief that we are fully responsible for other people in ways that are really unrealistic. Like we're not able to be the all in all of the time. We just do all that we can now and we care, but we're not able to change the circumstances. We can't change their minds for them. We can't change the outcomes. We can just be there for people, have compassion and bring a measure of healing for them. But it really leads you to a moment where you have to reflect and ask yourself, are you putting on your own oxygen mask before attempting to put masks on everybody around you? And I know that when you're a helping-hearted, caring, loving person, it's really hard to remember to take care of yourself, to manage and mitigate what's happening for you when you are caring and pouring yourself out. You have to find gas stations to go get filled up. You've got to get a mechanic to put some oil in there, right? So I want to help you with that. We'll talk about it in the next episode. I'm praying for all of you. The storm that you're in, the storms you've come through, I'm praying for you to find a supernatural peace that surpasses all understanding. And I think that when you do surrender to the Lord in it, that's when you get the peace that surpasses the understanding, is when you surrender the right that we often feel we have to be able to understand. Peace that surpasses understanding means that we don't actually need the understanding we thought we needed because we have the peace now, right? So I'm praying for the peace to come and be really tangible for you today. Love to you, friends. Talk to you in the next episode. If you'd like to work with me and get coaching, become a coach, or start a coaching business, check out all the courses and coaching I offer at sterlingandstonementoring.com, or you can scroll through the show notes to find all the links that you need. I pray that your day will be full of joy, hope, transformation, and the presence of God.